we're going to talk about an exciting, essential, but often ignored part of classroom instruction: formative assessment. You may be asking, why is formative assessment so important, and how is it relevant to my own practice? We'll talk about both the kinds of formative assessment, how to use it in your classroom, and why it's so important to help student achievement. It might be helpful at this point to provide a common definition for our assessment structure.
Our unit structure has two types of assessments: summative and formative. Summative assessments show what students know and are able to do in relation to the unit goal. Summative assessments come in two forms. The traditional test is a standard paper and pencil test with matching, multiple choice, or essay-type questions, while the performance assessment shows what students can holistically do in relation to the unit goal. While summative assessments show what students are able to do in relation to the unit goal, and often occur at the end of a unit, formative assessments show what students know and are able to do at the daily or lesson plan level. There are also two types of formative assessment: informal and formal. The main difference between the two types is that formal assessments are graded, whereas informal assessments are not. Because formal assessments are graded, it's necessary that each student independently and individually completes that formative assessment, whereas informal assessments can occur as individuals or in groups.
Now that we've established a common language and structure, you may be asking yourself, why is formative assessment so important in my practice? As you may know from experience and from research, formative assessment can provide huge gains in student achievement. Sure, you may be asking questions on a daily basis or giving quizzes, but do you consciously go into each lesson plan thinking, how do I formatively assess? How often do I assess? And what do I do based on those assessments? Research shows, in an exciting meta-analysis, that formative assessment, done frequently, can provide huge student gains.
The study shown here by Bangert-Drowns, Kulik and Kulik, and also shown in Marzano's The Art and Science of Teaching, shows that teachers who use formative assessments frequently have improved student gains. For example, teachers who gave 30 formative assessments, roughly 2 per week over a 15-week period, had student percentile gains of nearly 30%. Even more exciting, other studies have shown that not only does formative assessment help all students, but it differentially increases achievement to close the gap between low and high achievers.
Now let's look specifically at informal formative assessment. Informal formative assessment has many key components. First, it's ungraded. This is some informal occurrence such as questioning, or maybe a simple thumbs up or thumbs down to gauge what students have learned and understood over the course of an activity or a lesson. Here are a few examples of informal formative assessment that occur either individually, as a group, or as an entire class. First, let's talk about random questioning. Sure, as teachers, we question all the time, but who do we often call on? I know I always called on the one person who always had the answer, who always raised their hand first, because it made me feel good to think that, yes, my teaching is working. But that's not enough. We need to know what every student thinks, what every student knows and understands. That means at some point we have to question randomly. Second, we have things like whiteboards. These are sold commercially, quite expensive actually, but can be found at local home improvement stores as shower board or particle board that you can have them cut. Each student is given a dry erase board and a marker, and they might be asked, let's say, a math question that you throw out, 13 plus 3. Each student then individually writes the answer on their board, and when they're finished, hold it up for you to see. It provides a quick way for you to see exactly which students are understanding the concept and which are struggling. You can also differentiate learning by putting several questions or problems on the board. And once a student finishes, you can give them a thumbs up sign, and they can move on to the more difficult problems. Finally, let's look at some informal assessment that might occur at the end of a lesson to see the main points that students took away.
Exit cards come in many different forms and serve many different purposes. In general, at the end of the day, students are given an index card with a prompt, or a prompt is placed on the overhead projector. The exit card shown here is based on the game Two Truths and a Lie. Students are given a topic and are asked to write down 3 statements, 2 of which are true and 1 of which is false, in any random order. The cards are collected, and at the beginning of the period the next day, the teacher can hand the cards out to students and ask them to try and find the lie and correct it. This exit card asks students to make an analogy based on a particular concept. This pushes students to a high level of Bloom's taxonomy. This final example uses lists in 2 different ways. The top blue box contains a group of numbers with the questions, which doesn't belong and why. There are many answers to this question, and it pushes students to think about how numbers are related in new ways. The bottom box gives a group of words, in this case states, and students are asked to look at the relationship between the words and provide an appropriate title for the group.
Regardless of what strategy you use, the most important part of informal formative assessment is that it occurs often and helps you gauge what all students know.
Looking back at our unit assessment structure, we see that the other type of formative assessment is formal. Formal formative assessment is graded work. It must be done independently and individually, as it assesses what each student knows at the end of a lesson plan.
Formal formative assessments are simply quizzes or in-class seat work that, as I said, is done independently and individually. Finally, in reference to formal formative assessment, remember that first graphic I showed? That teachers who gave 2 formal formative assessments each week over a semester-long period showed huge gains, up to 30%. Think back to our unit structure. We believe that lessons aren't merely one day at a time. Otherwise, we have 180 different days that students have to put together. Rather, we chunk lessons into concepts that occur over 2 to 4 days, so that students can put together an entire concept and then be assessed. Well, if all of your lesson plans are 2 to 4 days, that means that over a 2-week period, you have roughly 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 formal formative assessments, close to that number that shows enormous gains for student achievement. Some final words about formative assessment. Formative assessment is most effective under 2 conditions. First, they occur frequently. This doesn't mean that they have to take an enormous amount of time in the classroom. No, they can be short, 2, 3, 4 question quizzes, questions, or whiteboards, but they should occur often. Second, teachers must make changes to their instructional practices in response to the formative assessment results. Otherwise, we may know what students understand and can do, but if we don't change our practices to help them and scaffold them towards that lesson plan objective, it's all for naught. I end with a comic anecdote about why formative assessment might be important in your classroom. When asked one time why formative assessment is important, a professor said, "You know, wouldn't you rather have a physical than an autopsy? So it is with our classrooms. We would much rather know, well before the final summative test, how our students are doing, so that we could help them and prevent them from doing poorly on these assessments." Indeed, if we enact continuous formative assessment and then act on those results, we should never be surprised by summative test results. Formative assessment is a proven, inexpensive way to increase student achievement and is practiced by all highly effective teachers.